Hi, everybody. Welcome to our fourth Whataboutery, the last of our online program, This is an Intervention. I am Renee van der Hoek. I'm the project manager at State of Fashion for This is an Intervention. Tonight's live from the Impact Hub here in the Netherlands. Before I introduce our incredible speakers, I wanted to briefly introduce State of Fashion to the new followers here with us today. State of Fashion is a fashion platform that connects pioneers in fashion design, research, and business. We stand for critical reflection on the fashion industry. With a biannual exhibition, discussion programs, labs for design, research, and publication, we explore how fashion can be changed for the better. Recent natural and political events, in addition to a climate crisis with severe consequences, have led State of Fashion to reflect on its core messages and its position. 2020 exposed the vulnerabilities of the existing system of fashion and showed again how our societies are still imbued with racism on many levels. In fashion, it revealed that ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusivity requires a critical and rigorous view on how the fashion system is organized as a whole. How can we as a platform contribute to a radical approach that challenges the industry at its roots? In the run-up to our next biannual in the spring of 2022, we started the program This is an Intervention. For this program, we offered thinkers and makers from all over the world to take over our platform. With long reads, online whatabouteries, interactive workshops, and inspiring visuals, a group of incredible change makers collectively reflected on the intersectionality of the problems within fashion and how we should move forward. First, we took a critical look at the fashion system during Intervention 1, Introspection, with guest editor Sandra Niese, making a case for a regenerative fashion system. For Intervention 2, Origins, we journeyed to India to explore the colonial history, the impacts on land, labor, and fashion, together with guest editor Aditi Meyer. For Intervention 3, Transition, Amsterdam-based platform Warehouse discussed the problematic relationship between fashion and capitalism and the pivotal role of critical fashion practitioners. And now it's time for Intervention 4, Themes Release, the final chapter of This is an Intervention. For this intervention, we are incredibly honored to be joined by guest editor and author ALOK for the release of the old-fashioned binary and the need to de-gender fashion. Together, we look into how fashion can contribute to a world that is more humane for and to all. In the past months, we have experienced what unlearning is and what educating yourself means. Now let's continue the work together. I want to thank all contributors to This is an Intervention for helping us to untangle our conditioned minds and move forward. This program was made possible by the generous support of the Prins Bernhard Cultuur Fund, the Creative Industry Fund, the Municipality of Arnhem, and the Province of Gelderland. And a big thank you to our key partners, Artes, Museum Arnhem, and Fashion and Design Festival Arnhem, as well, of course, to our own incredible team. Keep an eye on our channels, because in April, we will pass on the torch to the new curatorial team for the 2022 biannual. So, but now first it's time for Whataboutery 4, why we must de-gender fashion. And for this, I want to invite ALOK to join and take over the virtual stage, the moment you've all been waiting for. So if we can, ALOK wants to join.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Renee, and thank you, State of Fashion, for having me and for staging this important conversation and intervention. It feels like a historical reckoning that's been needing to take place for hundreds of years. And so I just want to acknowledge the unprecedented nature of this conversation and express my gratitude and conviction. Before proceeding, it's really important for me to let people know this is not a theoretical issue. This directly impacts the lives of so many vulnerable people across the world. In the United States, where I'm speaking to you from, 2020 was officially the most deadly year on record against the trans community, specifically Black and Indigenous, trans women, and trans feminine people. And in 2021, there's already been reports of 11 murders of trans and gender nonconforming people. And this is, of course, a conservative estimate, because when trans and gender nonconforming people experience hate violence, we're so often misgendered in the press and by our own families. So we will never actually have adequate data to describe what is an ongoing attempted genocide. And the reason that I bring up this violence is because so often this conversation around gender neutral fashion is discussed as a trend, is discussed as some sort of new fashion obsession. But actually, the reinvention that I want us to have today is to understand that de-gendering fashion is part of a multi-century project that was run and led by trans and gender variant racialized indigenous peoples across the world to actually reclaim style from Western norms of man and woman and sartorial cues associated with them. So in my intervention, one of the things that I really try to highlight for people is the ongoing resistance of trans and gender variant people of color to these Western gender cues by talking about Miss Noonan, a Mexican trans feminine individual who in the 1800s was out here actually designing their own clothing, insisting on wearing what they wanted to wear, and then being misgendered in death and having to posthumously deal with the trauma of colonial gender. And the reason that I spoke Miss Noonan's story in my intervention, which I hope you get to read, is because I really want us to remember not only the stakes of the conversation now, but that we're inheriting a struggle that people have been pushing for hundreds of years. And what that struggle fundamentally is about self-authorship and the ability to actually express ourselves on our own terms without being policed into other people's ideas of what a man or a woman should be. So moving beyond gender norms in fashion is not just a trend instigated by fast fashion. It's actually an ongoing tradition of resistance by trans and gender variant people. So when I was thinking about this conversation and how to do justice to actually ending the cross-dressing laws, which I talk about in the intervention, were a series of legislations across the United States, but I believe they also happened across the world, that made it a criminal act for people to wear clothing associated with the opposite sex. I wanted to bring in an actual designer into this conversation so that my strength, which I think is like theory and scholarship, could be in conversation with a practitioner to think about how do we actually design an alternative. So often we're fixated on critique, but I think as artists, it's important to remember that creation is the ultimate form of critique. When we create a viable alternative, then we can show people what it looks like to live in a more just, fecund, beautiful, and ebullient world. I couldn't think of a better partner for this than the brand Chromat. Chromat is a bodywear brand that is unisex, gender neutral, gender free, and has been taking public stances for trans and non-binary people for years, casting trans and non-binary Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color in their shows, and celebrating the diversity of beauty of gender and sexual diversity. And what I really appreciate about Chromat's approach to design is they're not doing this to be politically correct, they're doing this to be correct. They understand that bodies are diverse, messy, constantly becoming, that the prototype, the standard size of fashion fails us not just in terms of gender and race, but also size. And that the role of fashion should actually be about giving people creative autonomy to determine their own identities rather than prescribing who they should be and what they are. I'm excited to join Becca in conversation today and to pay particular attention to the struggles, the trials and the tribulations of trying to do design from a different place, not from a place that regurgitates the same old scripts and stories and visual cues that we've been taught, but actually one that is imagining and reckoning with a more robust and total form of vision and freedom for all. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Becca from Chromat, who I believe is going to start out with some photos to familiarize us more with the brand.
Thank you, ALOK. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with you, and thank you for saying all those nice things about the work that we do. I'm a huge fan of yours, so happy to be here. I guess I could just go right into the slides to let everybody know just a little background about who we are, what we do. My name is Becca McCharen-Tran. I'm the founder and creative director of the future forward body label Chromat. And our goal is to create perfectly fit garments for every body, recognizing that every body is different, and that's our big goal. So we recognize that, you know, the fashion industry has historically promoted a standard of beauty that centers white supremacist patriarchy and the straight male gaze, and forces anyone who isn't straight, white, tall, thin, cisgender, and able-bodied into the margins. So as fashion designers, we have the power to decide what size our clothes are sampled in, who's cast in our shows and campaigns, and having this platform is a responsibility. And I think every fashion designer, you know, should be utilizing their platform to empower others, and that's our goal. So I studied architecture, and I began Chromat as kind of an experiment in making scaffolding for the body. And swimwear has become a focus over the years. What I love about swim specifically is that the single garment can really have so much power and control over how someone feels about themselves. And I wanted to take our focus on celebrating all body types to a garment that's fraught with insecurity. We do things at Chromat, like, you know, our campaigns try to rewrite the rules around having a bikini body. And of course, you see on the slide, oh, the past slide, you know, I'm not doing this alone. I can't take credit for everything Chromat's doing. It's definitely a team effort. It's a collaboration from the beginning to the end. And I think if any young designers on this Zoom are watching this and thinking about, you know, starting your own brand, I think bringing in a team of people who don't think and look like you is so important, to have diverse perspectives in the design process. Not just, you know, casting a model from a different background to you is literally the bare minimum you can do. But I think, you know, the behind the scenes is so much, it's very, very important, even more important. You know, things like hiring a plus size or transgender photographer, or a woman of colors, or casting director, or Black makeup artist who knows how to work with all skin colors. It's just a more holistically inclusive output, and that's what we've always strived for. And so, yeah, if you want to, I can tell you a little bit more about our design process. As you see from our mannequins, we, over the years, have, you know, I think ALOK will get more into this, the nuts and bolts of how to make a label that celebrates all body types and all gender expressions. But, you know, what students learn in school and as fashion designers, they learn to drape and sketch on size 4, typically size 4 mannequins. And, you know, I think that is just the beginning of the process of kind of, you know, creating this narrow definition of who's fashionable, who's desirable, who deserves to have well-made clothes that fit them. It all begins in design school and what we're taught as young fashion designers. You know, even though in America, 67% of the American population wear above a size 14, but we're taught to design on size 4. So over the years, our design process at Chromat has shifted dramatically. And I wanted to show you a little video. It's like 1 minute long, but it's a peek into like how we make our fits work for all different body types. Like 5 years ago, well, I'll start by saying that I've had plus size and different body sizes on Chromat runway shows since the beginning. And like how we started as a brand, we were doing a lot of wholesale. So stores like Nordstrom, Barney, Selfridges, those were the people giving us money to, you know, create the collections and continue doing what we're doing. And they never ordered above a size large. So we only like could go to the factory with units, big enough units to make size extra small through large. And then we did all our other sizes, extra large through 4X, kind of like as a custom made basis. And that went on for many years, but it was actually Nordstrom about 5 years ago placed to order up to 3X. And this wholesale order kind of allowed us to have the power to go to our factory and be like, okay, it's not just, you know, we're not asking you just to design 5 units. Now we can design 50, you know, produce a lot more units. So that allowed us for the first time to expand our offering in a bigger way. So the first time we did that, we were really nervous. Like, you know, we'd been doing custom, but how are we going to know if we make 100 units of something, how are we going to know if it fits everyone? So this video that I'm about to show kind of shows our process of doing fit testing. So I'll just let you see a little behind the scenes.
wanted to do the Chromat fit test in order to test the new suits on a range of different bodies and silhouettes. It's our first time going up to 3XL with our sizing and fit over 300, probably more close to 500 suits in a matter of 4 days. I just went into this knowing that our fits wouldn't be perfect, and that is our ultimate goal in life. We want to make, swimsuits that empower a range of bodies that fit all bodies. That's like our big goal that, can never be achieved, but it's something we're always working towards.
The last project I'll leave you with is the collection that we debuted in 2020. And it was a creative reimagining of athletics as a gender inclusive space. Our 2020 collection looked at the Olympics specifically as an entity who sets the standard of gender policing that influences all levels of athletics, from pro sports to high school teams. World champions like Caster Semenya and Didi Chand are penalized and banned for not conforming to the International Olympic Committee's narrowed and arbitrarily defined definition of gender, which continues to change. So in protest of the stringent and exclusionary gender binary that's come to define these sporting events, we hosted a Chromat Olympic team training session at New York Fashion Week to visualize the future of gender fluid inclusion in sport. And then that led to the final slide I'll show you, which is a video we made in collaboration with filmmaker and artist Tourmaline to tell the stories of two young athletes, Terry Ann Miller and Andrea Yearwood, who became defendants that in a lawsuit that was put on by fellow high school runners that they ran against in Connecticut, and they were seeking to block the participation of transgender athletes in Connecticut high school sports, claiming that they had an unfair advantage. And I'll just say that currently in the US, over 26 states are attempting to create laws that ban trans youth from sports and make it a crime to provide healthcare for trans youth. So, we've seen the way that the Olympics polices gender, it trickles down and it influences young kids now who want to participate in sports, but are actively being banned by their legislators. So I'll just leave you with this last video and just, say that it's imperative to utilize all modes of cultural production to reinforce that trans and non-binary people deserve to be treated with care and respect. So you can play the video now.
Trans people and non-binary people are playing the sport because they love the sport and only for that reason.
They make it seem like we're the only two transgender athletes ever in the whole world, and we're really not. It's just that we speak up and we stand for ourselves.
If we are not going to, then who will?
One thing I love about sports is the way in which we can connect with our bodies.
What I love about sports is I just found a second family.
Having that love and solidarity when the world is telling you you're not lovable, that's beautiful.
Terry and I are my favorite athletes.
We did it like no other.
Yes, the fan club is strong.
I think our transness is the best thing in the world because it makes us who we are.
What is the potential for my body and how can I decide what that is? I think that trans people are the ultimate guides for sport.
Listen, I do track, but off the track, I'm that girl.
So yeah, that's the video by Tourmaline. I just dropped the link in the chat if you want to watch the full length video. So that's it for my presentation, and off to you, Alok.
Becca, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. And I just want to comment on, as I'm watching these videos and looking at these images, I really think about how visual culture doesn't just represent reality, it creates reality. And how what Chromat is doing is actually showing people that it's possible to expand imagination. And that is what is so exciting to me about fashion, because fashion for me is mobile art. It's being able to curate an exhibition every day and bring it to the world and expand people's parameters of what they thought beauty was, of what they thought gender was, of what they thought possibility was. And unfortunately, as you and I both know, that kind of cultural creative zeitgeist around fashion is not the mainstream fashion industry. So I guess I wanted to begin there, which is you have a beautiful and just framework of trying to design clothing for all bodies in a world that believes in standard sizing. How do you navigate a preconceived architecture of size, gender that is so entrenched within the mainstream fashion world?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been, I mean, I think I was actually lucky because I didn't go to fashion school, so I wasn't taught the rules. I went to architecture school, and for me, starting designing garments was sort of more structural experiments for the human body and making different scaffolding. And that's where it began. And also my first fashion show, it was just me begging my friends to model. I had no resources, I had no connections, but it was like, here, put this on. And I think that's kind of laid the foundation of how I think about models, is like the reflection of my community and people who inspire me, not necessarily the people who everyone else has considered a model historically. But yeah, there has been pushback, like I was kind of explaining about how we operated as a wholesale model for many years. That's how we got money to like, and this was like not investor backed. This is not a legacy brand. This is literally me and started in my bedroom. And you know, if one collection doesn't sell, then that's it. There's no safety net. And so we really relied on buyers from places like Barney's and Selfridges and other stores to like invest in each collection. We'd design the collection, show to them, they'd place an order, and the money from their orders went into the factory production and then designing the next collection. So you know, the buyers from those stores held a lot of power in the way we can operate. And I remember this was many, many years ago, but I worked with a sales team who, you know, would bring our line sheets and our lookbooks to these meetings with the buyers. I luckily wasn't there. That was something that I didn't have to participate in, so I'm really lucky. But I remember sitting down with my sales team, and she was like, you know, it's really cool that you have plus size models and trans models on the runway. I really think that's amazing. But, you know, when the buyers come in, they want to see something that they aspire to be. They want to be sold the dream. And, you know, the buyers are mainly middle-aged white ladies of a certain class. And, you know, I guess they weren't seeing their particular aspiration and like who we chose to shoot our lookbooks on, or, you know, and so that was difficult because they hold the purse strings. They hold the, you know, if they decide to invest in the collection, then that means we can continue. But, you know, I think it was more important for me to open up that aspiration and that dream of fashion to more people. And I think in the long run, it has supported us, because a year ago, based on feedback from our customers about our pricing being too high, we decided to actually let go of wholesale completely in order to kind of reduce that second markup. And we're fully like direct to consumer. So it's really the consumers that hold all the power for us now, and not so much the buyers from department stores. Oh, Alok, are you still there?
I'm back, sorry. I got cut off. Where did you end up?
Oh, basically just saying that, you know, having to rely on these gatekeepers in like buying from department stores for so many years, we were able to break free of that last year when we actually went direct to consumer. So we are no longer stocked in wholesalers, but we're sold online. And that way the customer and our like audience has complete control over what we sell and what we do. So we're more kind of relying on them for support, less these gatekeepers of fashion.
I think that's such a powerful intervention, because social media has allowed for this kind of direct to consumer relation that there never was before. And what we're seeing also is people aren't waiting to be represented in mainstream fashion. They're actually democratizing fashion and making it happen amongst themselves. And one of the things that I really try to turn people's attention to is oftentimes when we say fashion, we're rehearsing an idea of kind of fast fashion or luxury fashion that's not actually how everyday people are engaging in fashion and in resistance of fashion. And so one of the things I speak about in my long read is the legacy of these cross-dressing laws. And I make the point that fashion police for trans people was not ever a metaphor, it was our physical reality, that we would often be thrown into prison for looking like what I look like right now, and yet we would still do it. And what I'm finding in a lot of my historical research is that we used to design our own clothes, used to carry rags in our pockets to wipe off our makeup before the police came, used to build relationships with different venues or bars to hide our heels so that we could change in and out of our clothing. And what many people don't know is that they would often photograph us at the prisons when they would arrest us and put our addresses and our names in the newspapers so as to say, you can never dress like this again. And one of the things that I have found in my research time and time again is that in police records and reports, when people were asked, why are you cross-dressing? Oftentimes people would refuse to answer. And that refusal for me is actually a really powerful and poetic and prophetic way of living in the world, which is I don't need to explain what I do with my own body. And that sort of sensibility of saying I belong totally and irrevocably to myself, and there's no legitimacy to a law or an institution that is structured by anti-fabulosity and the restriction of possibility, I see echoed in the reverberations of that move you're alluding to in Chromat, which is, okay, there are the rules that have been established, but then there's what is right. And are we going to appeal to the rules? Are we going to appeal to what is right? And that journey is a difficult one because when you are templating forms of freedom that people are uncomfortable with, they will always misunderstand you, belittle, malign you. But I think your commitment to that actually really shows in the clothing. So I wanted to speak now about how gender neutral fashion is circulating within mainstream fashion orbits. Time and time again, I see the same mistakes made over and over again. Here are some of the mistakes. We see gray offered as the gender neutral marker. The idea is that color is somehow feminine and that the only way that we can move beyond gender and fashion is through grayness, maybe some iterations of black. And that is part of a larger frustration, which is an imagination that says that men's clothing is somehow gender neutral, whereas clothing that we associate with women and femininity is somehow never gender neutral. So we also see in fashion gender neutral conversations is things like the suit or the shirt get recirculated, or pants get recirculated as gender neutral, but then things like the skirt or the bra get constantly stuck or linked to womanhood, which is a larger problem of our social imagining of the human form as already always male, and our understanding that femininity and womanhood is somehow a departure from that. So it's already a patriarchal equation that makes us think that moving beyond the gender binary is moving beyond femininity. And then we see another thing, which is shapelessness, or sort of amorphous silhouettes that aren't body tight. And there's an understanding there that if you somehow reveal the body, then you're doing gender. And there's an understanding there that curvature in particular is gendered, which once again doesn't make sense, because for those of you who are listening, please remember that there are people of all sizes, of all genders. So when we're saying curvature is feminine, we're actually erasing that there are many people who are feminine who don't have those curves, and many people who are masculine who do, right? So we're actually using gender as a placeholder to talk about size, which often is what's actually happening. What I find so compelling about the work that Chromat is doing is that you're not falling into any of those traps, those pre-established ideas of shapelessness, grayness, expanse, and lack of body. In fact, you're foregrounding fuchsia, like extreme neon. The Chromat swimsuit that I have, which is notorious in my life, is extremely hot pink highlighter. Like it's the opposite of subtlety. It's, I think, the brightest article of clothing that I have in my wardrobe. And you're hyper emphasizing the body and making the body literal. So you're not trying to hide the body. And I don't think we see much of that marketed to us as gender neutral. And I'd love to hear about your thoughts about what it means to be making swimwear and bodywear with a gender neutral framework.
Yeah, that's definitely something I think a lot about, because I know we've talked in the past about how so much of unisex clothing or gender neutral clothing is like giant boxes, like a giant box square t-shirt. And, you know, for someone designing bodywear, swimwear, lingerie, things that deal with the body and the specifics of the body, it's something I think about all the time. And like people ask me like, oh, when are you going to make menswear? And I'm always like, well, who's to say a man can't wear anything that we offer right now? But I think we're actually working on a project right now with the trans femme filmmaker Tourmaline, who I showed our recent collaboration, and we're making swimwear for girls who don't tuck, so different bottoms that have more room. And so yeah, it's definitely like a great opportunity to think about, because we're already designing for different bust sizes without making it gender, just say full bust or small bust, or you know, it can be a full bottom, or you know, whatever you want to call the different articles of clothing that, you know, enable people who have all different shapes of body to like exist in swimwear. And but yeah, it's always been something I'm struggling with, because when you're talking about the body and dealing with anatomy, there's so much preconceived notion of what goes with what, and the to continue to like investigate those rules and create new imagery and creatively reimagine like what those rules can be. Wait, but I want to ask you a question, because I know you're a fashion designer too, and you have designed your own collections. Like, you know, you mentioned the people who were, you know, fighting against the cross-dressing laws. They made their own clothes. Like, how did you get into making your own clothes, and where do you see that?
Yeah, you know, I really struggled because for so long, no designers ever wanted to outfit me. I, as a performer, am constantly in need of looks. So it's like I'm actually the ideal kind of billboard for so many designers, because I'm constantly getting dressed up to do something in front of people. And people just wouldn't outfit me. And I would often hear this idea of, well, you know, our clothes aren't made for your body type. And I think that this is something that especially a lot of plus size people have to navigate with, which is why I feel like the plus size and degender fashion movement are intertwined, because they're both about challenging the prototypical or default body that fashion sees. And they're both actually about being honest to what fashion is rather than what fashion should be. What fashion is that there are people of different bodies wearing clothes all the time, and that's not political, it's just natural. And so I kind of got tired of having to appeal or style other clothes that were never made with me in mind. And my first collection I actually made directly in kind of conversation with some of the topics around cross-dressing laws, because the imagination I had is, what would I wear if I didn't fear violence? And what would my perception of femininity be if it wasn't mediated by threat and being hunted? And that was such a powerful and spiritual project for me. That was 4 years ago, because I realized that fashion can actually be a really profound form of therapy. Because in the intimacy of a photo shoot and being able to like model my own clothes in like a safe setting, I could create images of what freedom looked like for me, so that in other places in my life, or even on the way to the shoot, I remember I was in the back of a car in this gown and I was afraid. And I was like, this is why fashion is important to me, is because when I go to this photo shoot, I'm going to be able to create an image of myself, and I'll be able to remember that I'm real. Because so often this world makes it impossible for people like me to exist in public. And so fashion becomes one of the only places that we can be, let alone be regarded, let alone be celebrated. And so as I was working on that sort of first collection and designing, what I began to really realize is that queer and trans people have always been doing this work of self-fashioning. And I appreciate how you say that you came from architecture into design, because I think I had a lot of trepidation, being like, I don't get it, I don't understand fashion. But then I realized I authored my own life. I authored my own poems. I authored my own body. Why not author my own clothes? And that sort of relationship with textile has shifted everything for me, because it becomes a metaphor for navigating the world. This world says, this is the uniform you should wear. And most people just mistake that uniform as their skin and say, this is who I am. But the process of design is being able to say, no, I understand that what you're marketing to me as natural was measurements that you predetermined. And actually, I'm going to make other measurements and redesign reality for myself. And that idea of being able to tear apart something and rebuild it is exactly, I think, what we need in this world right now. Is to, one, denaturalize reality and say, reality is actually just a bad design project. Let's fail it. Let's move on, give it a bad critique, and let's redesign reality. And let's actually create something that does something different. And that's what I guess I was trying to do with my fashion design. I'd love to speak to you a little bit more about the mechanics of running this kind of business. One of the things that I think a lot about as an artist is so often I'm trying to create yearnings, longings, dreams, feelings that people don't know are possible yet. One of, I think, the worst things that you can tell an artist, especially a visionary artist, is you're ahead of your times. And that always frustrates me, because I'm literally like, what you're basically saying is you should not exist right now. And I think the onus should actually be on the world to be like, hey, world, shift so you can accommodate for this visionary thinker. When you're making your work, how do you have an uninterrupted relationship with your creativity and your dreaming without feeling that kind of fashion police or that gatekeeping or that voice in your head that's like, no, Becca, like you have to meet people where they're at?
Honestly, I can't say that I exist in that space of pure freedom. As someone who exists within capitalism and someone who's running a company, I always have to think, what will people buy, or like what will be comfortable for people? And yeah, that being ahead of your time thing is so annoying. It's definitely, it reminded me of like, you know, we've done different collections and then 5 years later seeing them like, or not even 5 years, 2 or 3 years later seeing them being knocked off by fast fashion brands, and, you know, realizing that something that you created out of a place of just, you know, wanting to create something new or experimenting is now making a ton of money for someone else, and, you know, with no link back to that support of that original thought, that process. But for me, I guess I honestly feel like my design process is so hard for me to articulate because it's such a collaborative process. It's never just me alone, you know, as this like prototypical like genius creative, like thinking of everything by myself. It's always, you know, me and my design team and collaborators. Like we've collaborated with scientists and all kinds of people outside of fashion. I think actually maybe that is the answer. It's like working with people outside of the system has helped. You know, I feel like if I come up with one idea and bring it to other people, it's always better with other people, and it's always better, you know, bouncing it off of, you know, people who don't know the rules, people not in the space. Like we've done like 3D printed dresses that expand and contract based on adrenaline, and we've done all kinds of cool collaborative projects over the years, things that inflate and deflate. And for me as an artist at the same time, I definitely utilize fashion as a way to synthesize the world around me. It is my creative outlet, and it is where I can like understand the world and also like, yeah, creatively reimagine and create different realities. And right now, during COVID, you know, I've been really diving into what fashion would look like outside of capitalism. That's why I really appreciate these talks, these Whatabouteries that Renee and her team have put on, because it's cool to see so many people trying to creatively reimagine this field, this design field that does exist within capitalism, and it is kind of this tool of capitalism right now, this tool of consumerism, but how can it exist how does it exist in a world where people are all treated with respect, including the people who make the clothes? So that's something that I guess the short answer is collaboration. I think that's for me the truest and most freest form of creativity.
And I think it's the most honest form of creativity too. I think collaboration is the natural orientation of the world. And when we try to parse out the cult of the individual genius, it's just dishonest. We're all part of these ecologies and ecosystems and networks. And I think that's what's really, I think, sad to me about how de-gendering fashion has been seen as just a trans agenda. Because actually, what I'm arguing is that the de-gendering of fashion expands horizons and possibilities for all people and all bodies. I think we really need to understand how our creativity has been so thoroughly eclipsed that we think of a color as having a gender. That is just so absurd and confining. I can't even, you're literally, there are entire swaths of color prints that you will never wear because of arbitrary designations and familiarizations with that as feminine. And then when we think about the silhouette of a skirt, which has been around for literally thousands of years, worn by people of all genders, and people will say that that is feminine, that's not just harming me as a trans person, that harms our collective psyche when we can't actually have an honest conversation to be we're taking arbitrary things and recruiting them into this agenda. And I think a lot of people don't understand that what I'm saying about de-gendering fashion is not about just supporting the trans community. Of course, it will have an impact on us, but I actually think it's going to fundamentally change the world for everyone, because we'll begin to realize that we've bought into these myths that have taught us that people are only worthy if they participate in gender norms. So with that in mind, I guess for my final question before we move to audience Q&A, and I'd really encourage folks to put in some questions into the Q&A section at the bottom, and I'll resource some of them. I'd love to hear and talk more about the future of fashion and what we'd like to see happen, what we'd like to see shift. One of the things that I've been fighting for many years is the complete and total de-gendering of beauty and fashion industries. And I want to clarify that position for people. For me, that doesn't look like doing a gender neutral capsule collection and then going back to designing gendered fashion. That doesn't even look like doing a men's line, a women's line, and a non-binary line. That also doesn't really capture what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that clothes inherently do not have a gender. Individuals get to participate in gender with that clothing. So a designer then should make a dress, not a woman's dress or a man's dress, and then the customer can actually decide what they do and how they interpret that dress. This looks like ceasing Men's Fashion Week and Women's Fashion Week. This looks like stopping to bifurcate products in stores along gender lines, and instead introducing new languages of talking about size and shape that have needed to happen for a very long time anyways, because what is a size 10 anyways, let alone across borders, right? So it's about creating a new form of literacy around size and shape that we should have already been having to begin with. And de-gendering fashion for me also looks like the kind of work that Chromat is doing in templating for us of building meaningful collaboration with trans and gender nonconforming communities. Because one of the fears that I have and I'm seeing all across the world right now is that even though, as I've demonstrated in my long read and I've done many times in my talks, even though trans and gender variant people have been doing this for literally hundreds of years, the minute that a white cis man does this, it's seen as revolutionary, it's seen as groundbreaking, it's seen as the moment, whenever we've been the moment, right? And so there's a way in which, like a very literal example of this is the inventor of artificial light, a photo technology that we now do with photo shoots, was a queer person who was the first photographer hired by Vogue and was never really credited as being one of the first out queer people in the early 1900s, right? So queer and trans people are actually so many of the architects of our mainstream beauty fashion ideas and aesthetics, but we get disarticulated from that history because misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia continually sees cis straight people as revelatory, and we're just afterthoughts. So what I also feel is that degender fashion can't just be a fashion conversation. It has to be a global reckoning of the trans struggle, which is why I want more fashion brands to actually more think about hiring trans talent, not just as models, but as designers, as creators, as filmmakers, as writers, as scripters, as makeup artists. I want us to think about rising up against the global wave of transphobia as a fashion issue. How can you be a fashion house in 21st century and allow people to say men and women shouldn't wear that? Like, no, we need to be actually articulating public stances against transphobia. And so it's not that, I think that what a lot of people mistake is that they'll say, okay, degender fashion is just for trans people, so that's not my bag. But no, it's for everyone, and it's possible for it to be for everyone, and it's possible to acknowledge the specific leadership of people within that community. So that's kind of what I'm dreaming for around the future of fashion. I'd love to hear some of your daydreams. Where do you want to see fashion go? What kind of conversations, what kind of designs would you like to be there in the future?
I love this future that you've painted for us. I definitely feel that, yeah, you're so right about the fact that not only do trans and non-binary people benefit from degendering fashion, everyone does. And just thinking about like all the expectations built around gender that we would be free from, and just the amazing, wonderful world that will be. I think for me, when I was hearing you talk and thinking about what do I actually want in the future, for me, obviously, it has to be a reallocation of resources. Running a fashion label is so expensive and it's so hard to get into. And I feel like there's so much talk about how do we make fashion more inclusive? Obviously, it's through the designers and the people making the decisions, the people making the brands. But not everyone can start a brand because, you know, the cost of production, the cost of, like, even that mannequin I showed at the beginning, the plus size mannequin cost $3,000. Like, that's not accessible for everyone, but I would love to see more people designing in the field. Obviously sustainability, and like not thinking of fashion just as a commodity, and that it has to be continuing to use up our resources. I think just more transparency. I think if people really knew what went into their clothes, who makes them, and just the environmental devastation that goes into the dyes, and, you know, every step of the way, just the same way that, you know, we don't really think about who made our iPhones, but it's just such a dark and colonizing process. I think just more transparency and more like awareness of the garments that you wear, and not only what they represent in the society, but like who made it and like what that represents to the production chain. I think that's something I'm interested in. But yeah, I think that those futures, just an awareness and a greater respect, I think that those futures, your futures and mine, are definitely intertwined, and I'm really excited to see more.
So beautiful. Okay, so now we're going to move to the Q&A, and please keep them coming and I'll try to integrate them. I'll answer the first one because I'm a big history buff, so I love flexing public historical knowledge. Someone's asking about what the origin of binary rules of fashion are, who came up with them, and why. And I'd love to break this down for people. So I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that our contemporary ideas of men's dress and women's dress are inextricably linked to European colonization. So what actually is important to understand is that makeup, adornment, things that we associate with femininity were historically worn by indigenous peoples across the world of all genders for thousands of years. And in fact, one of the primary mechanisms that imperialists and colonists used as a way to justify invasion and subsequent captivity and genocide of indigenous peoples was commenting on their sartorial dress. So there would be obsession around, why are these women bare-chested? Why are these men wearing dresses? Why are these men having long hair and having earrings? And the idea was, because men and women, or who they perceived to be men and women, were not performing Western European white gender norms, this was a marker of their degeneracy or backwardsness. And that's why colonization was necessary, or the white man's burden. So actually, one of the specific strategies of colonization was forcibly assimilating racialized people into European mores of dress. So what this actually looked like is banning cross-dressing. So in South Asia, where I'm from, the British actually created a criminal ordinance which made it illegal to visibly be gender nonconforming in public. And this looked like actually teaching men and women what to wear, putting them in reservation schools in what is now Turtle Island, where they were actually assimilated into Western mores of dress, right? And then it's important to understand here that even those Western mores of dress have a history within Europe. So the suit only became formalized as menswear in the 1820s. And the people who were designing the suit were actually designing it as a way to sculpt the male body and the male torso to look like Greek sculpture. This was part of a moment in the 19th century of trying to visually hyper-emphasize the differences between male bodies and female bodies as a way to justify oppression against women. So the idea became men are rational, autonomous, capable of movement and thought, whereas women are hyper-emotional, should be confined in the domestic sphere. So you see different designs around male and female garments and things that have been associated with masculinity historically within Europe, like wigs, lace, heels, makeup, blush. All these things were worn by men. I mean, look at 17th century French portraits. You see it there all the time. But then in the 19th century, those get recruited as part of this arsenal of defining the difference between men's and women's fashion, which was explicitly at its core about the subordination of women and about the subordination of racialized people, right? So some books that people can learn to learn about the history of fashion and the history of dress. A really great take on this is called Sex and Suits by the art historian Anne Hollander, where she describes how fashion became gendered and why in the 18th and 19th century. Another great book about colonial imposition of gendered fashion norms is White Women's Rights, The Racial Origins of Feminism in the United States. And then another book to get a sort of transnational perspective on how modes of dress and gender were assimilated on Indigenous peoples across the world is called The Invention of Women by Dr. Oyewumi, a Nigerian Yoruba feminist who talks about how the gender binary was imposed on Indigenous Yoruba people by European imperialists. So when we're saying de-gender fashion, a lot of times people say this is a new conversation, but what I really want us to always interject there and be like, new for whom? And that the leadership of this begins with Black and brown people across the world who've been doing this for literally thousands of years. Where I'm from in South India, I grew up with men in skirts all the time, and that was not a man in a skirt. Like, so when we're thinking about these cross-dressing laws, producing ideas of what a man and woman should look like, those are also ideas of what white men and white women should look like, that were explicitly about erasing the different traditions of Indigenous, Black, and racialized masculinity and femininity. Okay, so the next question I'm gonna pose to you, Becca, is, do you believe that existing brands can make the shift into de-gendering fashion, or is it up to younger brands such as Chromat to do this work?
I think definitely. I think everyone can do it. There's really no reason not to and no excuse not to. I think for bigger brands, I think they have the resources to do this at a mass scale. And I think maybe, you know, there's so much kind of like, well, I feel like old brands definitely are hindered by the fact that they have such established history and tradition, and a lot of people want to continue to regurgitate that because they know they have their core audience and their core customer. But I do think that like big brands with the resources, they have the opportunity to really transform the landscape. I think there's just a lot more risk because they risk losing money. So I think if they're not doing what they've always done, and I think that's, you know, for bigger brands, if getting money is their goal, then I think it's hard to change. And I think for younger brands who maybe don't even have money to begin with or don't have the resources, there's nothing to lose by doing something that they believe in. And I think maybe that's one risk that more established brands run into.
Right. I think that comes up time and time again when I'm liaising with different brands, as they say, We agree with you intellectually, but our customers aren't there yet and we're afraid of losing money. And that is a chicken and egg situation that really frustrates me, because if no one is willing to take the stance that's right, of course we're not going to change anything. But if we were to have some of these heritage and luxury brands really proactively say, hey, everyone, let's abandon 19th century Victorian gender norms that were literally basic and like rooted in entrenched misogyny and racism, and let's actually live a 21st century life that acknowledges the radiant beauty of all people, the reverberations of that would be so mega. And I think that's what's really frustrating, is that like this will help you in the long run too. People are moving from a short-sighted thinking of being like, okay, people aren't initially going to be ready. But let's talk about the history of pants on women. That's another history that I think is really important to understand. 100 years ago, a whole ass century ago, women were being beaten in public for wearing pants in the United States and in Holland, right? And in fact, one of the primary goals of feminist reformers in the early 20th century was dress reform. This looked like the Rational Dress Society in the United Kingdom. This looked like the Bloomer movement in the US. And women were basically saying, we demand the right to wear pants. And then we're like, how dare you infringe on male authority? You look ridiculous wearing pants, stay at home. And it was seen as a threat to male power for women to wear pants, because it was associated with women being able to navigate the public without men. The term public woman was actually a slur used to describe sex workers, because there was no imagining of a woman being able to exist in public without a male escort, right? And how did we get to a place where in 2021, Zendaya is the face of the contemporary suit? Where did we get there? It's because there were individual women, individual transmasculine people, individual butches, working class Black people who resisted cross-dressing legislation, resisted people calling them names, ridiculing them. Some of the first memes were created in the early 20th century, which were postcards mocking women's aspiration for political emancipation by depicting women as gender nonconforming and androgynous, right? So this has always been a strategy to humiliate women as, oh, you have facial hair, ha ha ha, because they don't want to engage with the legitimate political criticism. They make fun of your body. And that's how we got it, is by women like Barbara Streisand actually making bold stances before it was popular to wear pants to award ceremonies, and people being like, what are you doing? You look like you're wearing pajamas. It was individuals making dissenting acts that led to the cultural transformation that normalized pants for women. And then here we are in 2021, where we have people who are so upset about people they perceive to be men wearing dresses. And it is the exact same rhetoric that there was 100 years ago. I'm like, give me something new, you know, like give me some new consternation, some new frustration, but it's literally the exact same debate. And it's the exact same rhetoric of civilization's gonna end. What have we done? Like that's exactly what men were saying about women wearing pants in the late 20th century. And yet we didn't learn from then. And what we can learn from then is that the way that we change culture is not by backing down, but by being principled and actually saying we're doing this because it's right. So we're not de-gendering fashion because it's politically correct. We're de-gendering fashion because it's correct. And if brands start making this choice, it's going to naturally create the cultural conditions that are going to change the industry and that are actually going to end up making you money in the future. And it's gross that we have to say that, but that's the truth. Okay, so now we got another question in the chat about navigating the design and fashion worlds as queer and trans designers. How do we focus on what we want to create for ourselves and move into the world we want to address, considering an industry that is so structured by these old school ways of thinking?
You want to answer that?
Yeah, sure.
That made me think of Gogo Graham and how she's doing so much work specifically designing for trans femme women and selling her things on Depop. I think it's cool that she's, I guess with new technology, more designers have their customer at their fingertips. Like you were saying, there's more accessibility that you can interface directly with your customer. So you can build out that network of designing for other trans femmes through your connections made online. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, I was gonna say, obviously, we live in a system that is messed up, but don't allow that to restrict your daydreaming, because truly visionary work will get the people energetically that need to see it to be there. And I think we often believe and normalize the idea that there have to be trade-offs. So we say, here's my passion project, but it's not going to be. And so we self-censor and we don't fight and rally for our passion project. But I really want to encourage queer and trans designers to know you're a badass and you have to believe in your work because other people aren't going to believe in you. And the way that I learned how to believe in my work was by learning history. And that's why I keep on resourcing history. And I wanted to address another question in the chat about this, about the Mexican trans woman that I named was misnamed Miss Noonan. And I write about her in my long read. And if you want to read more about her history, at the end of my long read, I have a couple of book suggestions. One of them is calling Redressing America's Frontier Past, the history of cross-dressing in the West. And that sort of details a lot of her life story. But I find people like Miss Noonan from the 1800s who were designing their own clothes. And her story is so tragic because basically she told everyone around her that when she died, she wanted to be buried in her own clothes. And people didn't acknowledge that request and they changed her outfit and then found that her anatomy wasn't consistent with what they thought a woman should be. And so then they outed her posthumously. And it became this viral story all across the country of the Mexican cross-dresser, which eventually led to her husband committing suicide because he was being harassed so much, right? And I read this story and I'm so sad and I'm also so happy because in the 1800s, the girls were designing fashion and technology and saying like, see me for who I am. Let me design my own body. I want to die in my own clothes. Like how beautiful and powerful is that? That someone who had no access to community, didn't have access to the kind of language that I have now, was able to dream like that. That gives me permission to exist more audaciously in the way that I live. So when you're feeling impossible or feeling lonely, connect with brands like Chromat. Find your peers that can remind you what you're doing is important. Find your ancestors and your transcestors historically to remember that you're not unprecedented and you're part of something greater than yourself. Becca, you mentioned GoGoGram, which I think everyone should check out. Are there any other designers or brands that you think are doing some really cool work that you want to shout out?
Oh, shit. Let me think. Obviously, Telfar comes to mind. I think the way that he is showing up for queer Black people in high fashion spaces. Chris Harrington is a queer Black femme making clothes for other queer people. Let me think. I saw someone post like, what advice do you have for young POC designers or starting out in the industry? And I guess, obviously I can't speak to being a person of color and that specific experience starting your own brand through that lens, but I would say that starting a fashion brand, I think my experience was that to network sideways, and I know a lot of people have said this, but working with your friends and supporting your friends and your friends supporting you, I think that's more powerful than, you know, getting the approval of someone at Vogue or, you know, someone in this, what you perceive as like a high place within the industry. I think, yeah, designing for yourself and your friends is really powerful and a great place to start. And that I've seen so many other brands build their community first, and then, you know, like you said, ALOK, that people are energetically connected and attracted to that energy that you create with your community.
Yeah, totally. There's a question here about Eurocentricism and the Fashion Academy, and I'd love to speak to that. So often in a lot of fashion scholarship and fashion studies, people are only engaging with textiles and traditions within the West. And this is most notoriously led to people dismissing aesthetic histories of thousands of years in the global South. People often associate racialized people, and specifically Black and Indigenous people, with nakedness as part of this prehistoric anthropological colonial mode of thinking that doesn't think that Indigenous people, Black people, and people of color have a relationship with dress. And that's really messed up. And so I think what happens is, once again, that's the detriment to academic scholarship, is that people's historical archive is literally like 300 years long. They don't understand that like there was ways of doing gender, ways of doing fashion for thousands of years in other places. So it's about expanding that horizon and naming explicitly that de-gendering fashion is also about decolonizing fashion. And this is why I'm really excited about, at Ryerson University, I believe it's Ryerson, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, someone, in Toronto, there's a new institute there on race and fashion. And they've started to really put out some writing on the histories of colonization and fashion by an incredible Black woman fashion scholar there. I'm forgetting her name right now, but I really recommend checking out Kimberly Jenkins. Yes, Dr. Kimberly Jenkins, right? And so there's a new reckoning now in fashion studies, especially with the mobilizations around Black Lives Matter, not one more, around having to actually reckon with the whiteness of the ways that we think about fashion. And that's, I think, what's particularly difficult for me often in engaging conversations around de-gender fashion, is that the media continually manufactures this as new. And it's just so confusing to me, because I literally have images of people from the 1700s where I'm from looking like this. So it's not new. And in fact, it's not an innocent thing to say that this is new. It's actually a colonizing imperative that disappears thousands of years of cultural, political, ancestral legacy and history, right? And so it's really important, whenever people dismiss this conversation as newfangled phenomenon, we enter the chat and we ask new to whom? And we amplify the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people who have been fighting for self-determination, not just of dress, but of land and of lives for a very long time. Then there's another question. We'll take about 2 more questions here before we wrap up. So if there's any last pressing questions that you have, please put them in the Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone for your time and for these generous questions. Is around the role of social media. So someone's saying, how do you see the responsibility of social media companies and the prevention of spreading hate and negativity about a topic such as de-gendering? Look, 80%, Media Matters, which is an organization that tracks media trends in the US, found that about 80% of news stories around trans people are fear-mongering, not factually correct. And so social media has actually created this incredible transphobia that actually is not based in reality, and it's just based in fear. So the way that that's infected the de-gendering conversation is people will say, they're taking away our right to be men and women. That has become the sort of social media narrative of what de-gendering fashion is that de-gendering fashion is erasing womanhood or erasing manhood. And that could not be farther from the truth. De-gendering fashion is about giving permission and license to individuals to declare their own gender. If you decide to declare your gender as man or woman, that's totally fine. This is not about erasing your ability to be a man or woman. If you want to wear a dress and you feel feminine in that dress, that's totally fine. What de-gendering fashion is about saying is, you don't get to say that that dress is feminine for other people. It's literally just about saying, hey, develop your own relationship with your own gender and don't police other people's gender. And it's not these like scary people that are trying to erase your right to dress like as a man or woman or traditional values. That is what happens when social media gives platform to people's words about us and not our actual realities. And that's what the situation we're finding ourselves in right now. Becca, did you have anything to say about social media?
I think it is dangerous to rely on that completely to connect with your customer, your audience, your fans, because as we know, like we've seen with, you know, Tumblr, like eliminating all sex workers from their platform, it's like building your whole life on shifting sands, and you never know when they're going to take it away from you. So I feel like social media can be a great tool as a young designer to meet other people and to meet your customer and to debut new collections. But you know, it's also important to engage in real life, or with email. There's just, I don't know, I think it's dangerous. Like I remember when our friends Kimberly Drew and Jenna Wortham, they launched the Black Futures book, and they wanted to create a physical archive of the artists and the people that they are inspired by online, because you never know when you know, someone's going to yank the platform from you. And so to create like a hard copy book form was so important to them, to create physical space and physical things. So yeah, I think it is dangerous to build entire empires on someone else's platform that they control.
Yeah. Okay, and we've got our final question, and I think this is more of like a technical one, is, you know, the idea of androgynous clothing or non-binary fashion often makes people think of traditional menswear, so like wearing suits or shirts or pants, but we still have not been able to see things like a skirt, a dress, let alone a bikini, as gender neutral. What do you think we can do to really start interrogating that realm of the conversation? Because I think that in designing swimwear in particular, it's such a gendered space. Can you speak to some strategies around de-gendering swimwear?
Well, I think that's something that we're exploring right now with the collaboration we're creating with Tourmaline, to show that, you know, people, specifically we're creating swim bottoms for girls who don't tuck, for trans feminine women who don't choose to subscribe to this like one idea of femininity where it has to be this kind of like flat tuck bottom. And I think for us, our realm is like creating imagery around different, like just a variety of gender presentations to show that there's more than one way to wear swimwear, and to be free and to be happy and to be accepted and to be considered, you know, having a bikini body. I think for us, just it's about creating imagery. And I think like working with Tourmaline, who is a filmmaker and artist, I think she understands that inherently about how the images you see kind of shape how you feel about society and about yourself. So that's something that we're working towards right now.
And you're doing such a great job at it. Thank you so much, Becca, for your due diligence and for your rampant imagination, your daydreaming, your living in the future now. It's really an honor to experience the art that you put out into the world. And thank you so much, Renee and State of Fashion, for creating the platform for these kinds of interventions. I really want a couple of sort of action takeaways before we close. It's really important to me that this conversation not just be dismissed as theoretical or hypothetical. As I sort of began with outlining the extreme violence that trans and gender nonconforming people face, we don't just de-gender fashion as an intellectual project. We have to really understand this as an anti-violence project. And so please take the things that you learned today and think about in your own life, how are you reproducing stereotypical ideas of gendered dress? And how do you create space for people to actually wear what they want to wear and feel safe and celebrated in that? How do you speak back to the brands that you admire or are in conversation with about the ways in which they're marketing arbitrary gender stereotypes and norms? This work shouldn't just be on queer and trans designers, it should be on everyone. And it's not about being political, it's about being accurate or correct. Then another thing we can really start to do is to invest in the creative leadership and imagination and art making of queer and trans designers of color who are creating the mood board for revolutionary ways of being, and often are struggling because people will constantly dismiss their craft as self-indulgent or unnecessary or superfluous. But there's so many creatives I know, and please just go and check out Chromat's photo shoot from the New York Fashion Week of 2020. You'll see so many luminaries there that are people who have the answers. So it's not just that the answers don't exist, it's often that the people with the answers aren't actually resourced and centered to actually do that. So think about how to create opportunities for those kinds of people. Becca, are there any last call to actions that you have before we close?
I just want to thank you, Alok, for articulating this vision in such a beautiful and like expansive way. I wish people could see your garments as well, because I do feel like they exist outside of this kind of like unisex gray boxless shaped fashion that people might think of when they think of, you know, non-gendered clothing. I think you represent the possibilities and just the beauty and like lusciousness, and it's just dripping with joy and color and excitement. And I think like the world that you're creating is a world that everyone wants to live in. It's the world that is fun and filled with love and joy. And I think that's something that, you know, should never be separated from the academia. It's just the joy that you bring and you create. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Have a good day.
See you soon.